Good morning. Thank you for joining us here on the iHeart Community Spotlight, a weekly public affairs program. I'm Mark Carbonaro, Public Affairs Director, and today we are joined by a couple of special guests via telephone. We are joined by Spencer Critchley, who's an award-winning writer, producer, and communications consultant with experience in broadcasting, film, digital media, public relations, advertising, and music. And he's the managing partner of Boots Road Group, LLC, a marketing communications agency. As a communications consultant, Spencer has worked for Barack Obama's 2008 and 2012 presidential campaigns, the Monterey Jazz Festival, the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, and many others. He joins us today along with Mike Madrid, who's a nationally recognized expert on Latino voting trends, former press secretary for the California Republican Leader, and the former political director for the California Republican Party and the founder of Consultancy Grassroots Lab. Mike and Spencer, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much, Mark.
Thanks for having us.
Well, it's great to have you both on the program, and we have a great topic to discuss today. And normally on this program, just to explain, we talk about issues that exist in our community. And a lot of times they're kind of hands-on issues. They're tangible things like homelessness and affordable housing or hunger, right? These are things that you can actually put your hands on. But the idea of saving democracy and that our democracy is in peril in certain respects is something that's, it's more of a mind share kind of thing. It's something you got to get your head around. And it's not necessarily something that you can put and hold in your hands, but it's just as important as those other things, at least in my opinion, how we treat each other when we're discussing the issues of the day. And to that end, Spencer is putting together a series of seminars and programs on saving democracy. The next one is coming up on March 21st at Cabrillo College in Aptos. And Spencer, maybe the best way to start out is if you could explain to us the concept behind saving democracy and what moved you, what spurred you to move in this direction.
Well, over the past few years, it's really just seeing democracy apparently in crisis in the United States and across the democratic world. And I think it's a bigger problem than the partisan argument we see going on. It's a problem that exists above that, which is this loss of faith in democracy itself and loss of support for it, in some cases even attacks on the basic institutions and norms of democracy. And so we see people assuming the worst about each other and dividing into these tribal groups. Instead of what I think would be a better approach is start from assuming the best in each other, including people with whom you strongly disagree. Of course, you're going to find some people in the world who just are arguing out of bad faith and you can't have a good discussion with them. Mm-hmm. But most people are actually doing what they think is right. And if you start from that position of listening and an assumption that someone has good intentions, then you can have a really vigorous debate, but it doesn't have to be an actual attack on each other, and it doesn't have to undermine the way democracy is supposed to work.
Mm-hmm. Mike Madrid, let me bring you in on this. What are your thoughts on this issue?
Well, look, I think Spencer's exactly right. I will say this, though. I don't think that it's simply a function of us being better to each other, and I'm not suggesting that that's all that he's saying, but there are some very clear demographic, social dynamics that have created this very acerbic environment that is testing some of the norms that we've known for at least the past 2 centuries, and that is there are really 3 that are happening at the same time. First is this exponential growth in technology, which is allowing us to segment more and more amongst people that we both agree with and remove ourselves from those that we disagree with. The second is this extraordinary wealth gap that is getting bigger and bigger at a rate faster than we've seen really in at least a century. And this class divide is creating a lot of the populist movements that we've been seeing across not just the Western world, but really even in Africa and in Latin America. And it's something that I think we're not paying enough attention to. Mm-hmm. And the third, of course, is this extraordinary and unprecedented demographic change. The actual look of America is changing. And so any one of these would be a very significant challenge to test not just the way that we govern, but the way that we interact with one another. But all 3 are happening at precisely the same moment. And so I would suggest that a lot of our inability to discuss or have interactions with one another isn't something that's changed because we just simply are a little bit less open-minded. needed, there are actually some very significant social dynamics that are testing our ability as human beings to interact the way that we've known in the recent past.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think those are all three are really great points. I completely agree. People don't get into a situation like this just because they decide to be nasty to each other. I think the solution is for us to start listening to each other and starting to explore issues like these together instead of just making the assumption that, well, the reason you're acting like that is because you're an evil person or you're stupid, which seems to be the default during these kinds of arguments. You've got two choices. You're either evil or stupid if you disagree with me. But I think Mike is exactly right. When people start acting like this, it's because of underlying factors like the ones he points to.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned technology, this exponential growth in technology. I would think that social media has a lot to do with this dividing and also this hostility that people develop over political ideas and political divisions. Go on Facebook at any time and where people are talking about some issue of the day, and at a certain point, it just degenerates into name calling and invective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the problems with social media, and there's some really good thinking going on this score, for example, by a guy named Jordan Lanier, who is one of the pioneers of virtual reality in the early days and is a brilliant technologist, and there are others thinking along these lines, is that we're kind of at the mercy of software algorithms here that are designed to create addictive experiences for us, and they're designed to figure out what rings our bells, so to speak, and then give us more of that. So there have been experiments run where, you type in a particular topic that might seem fairly innocuous on its own and start searching for YouTube videos or start looking at that kind of content in Facebook, and you keep getting led to more and more extreme versions of the same topic, and before you know it, you're looking at hate videos or something. And that is one of the things that tends to increase divisions. And then another one is that it's so easy to choose and exclude your friends on a social media platform, and in a way it's kind of like the online equivalent of driving in your car and indulging in road rage. Mm-hmm. You'll yell and curse and shake your fist at people and behave in ways you would never dream of doing if you were actually standing there dealing with them face to face. So we see a lot of that kind of behavior online as well.
Boy, isn't that true? A friend of mine, I should quote that, Facebook friends of mine that get into these arguments, and I think to myself, wait a minute, you just called this person the most horrible four-letter word that you could use. I doubt that you would have said that if you were face-to-face, sitting across the table from them, but because you kind of have this protective shield of the computer screen, and you're not even anonymous. I mean, you all know each other's names.
Yeah.
And yet, but where does this anger come from? I guess that's the other thing too, is that for the most part, there's a certain arrogance that all human beings have, that they believe in the superiority of their opinion, right? And then oftentimes what happens is that, carrying that to the extreme allows people to engage in this type of vitriol.
Yeah, well, and I'd be interested to hear Mike's perspective on this as well, but I'd just add quickly that there's a lot of psychological research that says that's exactly the way our minds work. We have this tremendous cognitive bias towards what we already want to believe, and then we will just seek out and cherry pick facts that support what we want to believe, and it's very difficult for us to confront facts that contradict what we want to believe. And in fact, we'll just instinctively reject those facts. Mm-hmm. And then you combine that with the power of software and also just the power of marketing, which has become more and more scientific over the years and more powerful. And you have essentially a giant machinery designed to exploit the way the human brain works. And unfortunately, there's a ton of money to be made in provoking people and making them angry, and it ends up being profitable. So that's part of it as well.
Yeah, look, I think that's all largely right. Let me kind of embellish or explain a little bit further also. Social media is really wasn't the creator of this. A lot of these social dynamics that have created a more partisanized, polarized society in the United States has been happening for some time. A lot of social demographers have noticed this started happening really in the mid-1970s, where we as practitioners, as political consultants, started to notice some very trends. The first is in the first race between, the first and only race between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, only about 15 to 17% of the country's counties were what we called landslide counties, meaning they voted 80% or more for one candidate. By this last election cycle, that number had gone from 15 to 16% to 80%.
Wow.
meaning people were literally moving themselves physically into communities and neighborhoods of people who were ideologically similar to them. And again, a lot of this is a function of technology and social change, where mobility and frankly the price of airfare would allow people to kind of move to different parts of the country where they wanted to self-select and self-sort and be around people and communities that affirm their kind of worldview, not just politically, but socially and generally. And what that's created is an environment in a democracy where the ability and frankly the virtue in compromise has become a vice. If you no longer stand up strongly for the group that you believe in or associate with, you're somehow traitorous, or you're somehow undermining the role or the positions of your own community. And that again is to watch legislators, and there are very few of them now, who are willing to compromise or work across party lines. The absolute attacks that come from within their own ranks for simply trying to work across party lines is quite extraordinary. Because again, we have become a nation we are no longer a nation of undecided people. Again, in that same election cycle, Carter versus Reagan in 1980, for example, a month before the election, 30% of Americans were undecided on who they were going to vote for. By 2000, by the time Mitt Romney was accepting the nomination and running against Barack Obama, 3% were undecided. So the art and the practice of marketing, as Spencer pointed out, and political consulting, my profession, 25 years ago, it was the art of persuasion. Our goal was to try to reach into the middle and convince people that this candidate had better ideas. We no longer do that. It's really focused on mobilization, oftentimes, unfortunately, using fear and anger and hostility, because those are the best motivators to get your tribe out to vote. And in that environment, compromise or bipartisanship is again, it's a vice. It's seen as traitorous, and it's not something that we value anymore as a society.
Boy, we saw that.
Yeah,
go ahead, Spencer.
Well, I was going to say that, as Mike says, tribalism has been with us throughout human history. And in my opinion, in the United States, we overlooked the power of tribalism for a long time because our society, in terms of who was basically running it, was so homogeneous for a long time. So, of course, when the country was founded, it was accepted as a given that men ran things. And, of course, they would be white men, and they'd be white men who owned property. And even well into the 20th century, it was still largely true that we had this homogeneous picture of what an American was. It was basically a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And as we started to welcome more people in, not just to the culture through movies and entertainment or the conversation, but actually starting to give people access to better neighborhoods and to become part of the political power structure, I think that's where we started to see a lot of this tribalism really show up, because for the first time, people who just sort of assumed, well, it's the normal world is us white people who are probably Christian Protestants. Suddenly they're dealing with a lot of people who look different and have different faiths or have no faith and all of these differences. And that's when you start to see tribalism surge, and you start to see this self-sorting that Mike's describing, where people start actually moving to different neighborhoods. They move out of the downtown areas out to the suburbs. They start putting their kids into private school instead of public school, and we've really seen that happen the past few decades.
When you talk about the self-selecting and the people moving, and Mike mentioned this, that the landslide counties were 13% in 1976? Was that the figure?
Yeah, about 15%.
15%. And you talk about the changes that technology has brought. Well, I think that these two go hand in hand, because as the technology industries have grown and the jobs, for people in technology, in many instances, they pay so well. And this has contributed to this wealth gap that we see. And then at the same time, people who don't have a technology background, maybe they don't have the same level of education as those who are in technology. They've been priced out a lot of those areas. I mean, some of that moving, or maybe even a lot of that moving and self-selecting, has been, people have been priced out of areas that in previous generations they could live there. Look at the Monterey Peninsula or even the Silicon Valley. I grew up in what is today called Silicon Valley. In the neighborhood that I grew up in, there were bartenders, and there were paint contractors and tradesmen and politicians and business people. It was an economically diverse neighborhood, and it was considered a middle-class neighborhood. That same neighborhood today has a median income of $97,000, and all but the technology folks have been priced out of that neighborhood. So isn't that also part of it, where people have been priced out of areas, Mike, and they've had to move?
Well, what you're touching on is exactly right. Correlation between, look, I'm teaching a course at the University of Southern California this semester. The title of the course is Race, Class, and Partisanship. It's the intersection of everything that you just explained, because in California, while we are the most diverse state in the nation, we are also likely the most segregated, because there is a direct correlation between education and race. And that creates a wealth effect, which begins to then create a self-selection process. So the examples that you brought up in your life experience is a perfect encapsulation of that. San Francisco and the East Bay counties are actually becoming more white. They're becoming whiter. A little bit of Asian influence, but we are driving out Latinos and African Americans. Well, Latinos are the largest ethnic plurality. And so what we're seeing is where these clusters of a growing wealth accumulation are happening, you are also seeing what we call these white islands. And they're the small areas of upper class, middle class, or just truly wealthy communities that are overwhelmingly white. Some Asian and some increasingly Asian, but they're becoming less diverse in a state that is becoming more diverse. What that also means is that the poorer communities are becoming homogenous also, but they have a very different look and complexion and education level than those other communities. So while we talk about our diversity in California, we kind of hold that up as a civic virtue, the reality is we are the state with the largest income inequality divide, and that there's a huge racial correlation to income. And that means there's a racial correlation to where we live and who we talk to and who we communicate with, and that is making it exceedingly difficult to have a truly pluralistic society. In fact, California, kind of as the home of the resistance, quote unquote, really embodies the exact opposite of that diversity and that tolerance and that interaction because of this correlation between wealth and race. And if history has taught us anything, wherever there is a society where there is extraordinary wealth accumulation with one ethnic and racial group at the top of the pyramid that is getting smaller and smaller, and an expanding base of poverty with another ethnic group that is getting bigger and bigger, that story does not end well. Nowhere in history has that ever ended well. And that's where we are barreling down the road here in California at a rate faster than any time in certainly in American history, probably matching, historical events of the past few centuries.
Yeah.
I think that's such an important point. And, this is an example of the kind of conversation that we'll be having at Saving Democracy at Cabrillo on March 21st. And let me slip in a plug. If people want to come, the admission is free, and they can find the information at bootsroad.com/democracy. And what I want to point out here is, Mike has made a career as a Republican consultant and as an expert on voting trends, especially in the Latino community. I'm a Democrat, and this is something where we need to have serious, substantive conversations addressing issues like he's just raised.
Right.
And I would say, it's all too easy, speaking of tribalism, it's all too easy for a liberal like me to say, well, if there's a problem, with race and income and segregation in this country, it's because of all those people on the other side, because they're all a bunch of racists. I mean, it's hard to find a state, and certainly a region like the San Francisco Bay Area and the greater San Francisco Bay Area that we're in, that's more liberal overall, and yet look at the incredible wealth gap and the incredible segregation that's happening. And as you suggested, Mark, a lot of that is driven by technology companies that create enormous amounts of money, but it flows to a tiny number of people at the top of the pyramid. And we see segregation by ethnicity, and we also see segregation within the white community too, because there's a lot of elite white people who've left working class white people behind, and there's a great deal of the resentment that liberals might identify as simple racism that might be more class-based and more a sense of just being dismissed by the white people who are lucky enough to be succeeding in this economy.
Yeah, and then you wonder where populism comes from. Well, populism rises up from the lower middle class, the middle class, and those below, because they're looking for answers, because they feel they've been given a short end of the stick, and in a lot of respects they have.
Yeah, and unfortunately, people who are angry and afraid are really vulnerable to simple answers.
Right. Going back to people not talking and the self-selecting, I'm reminded of something. My ex, we met in 1992. She's very liberal. I'm more conservative. We wouldn't have met today. We might have run across each other online, but then this self-selecting process would have come in, and it was, oh, well, if you voted for so-and-so, I can't go out with you. I don't remember that existing 25 years ago, or even earlier than that. You know, that someone would say, if you're a Republican, I don't want to date you. Or if you're a Democrat, I don't want to have coffee with you and date you. You know, I only want to be with people who agree with my worldview. Now you see that. You see people on Facebook talking that way. People on dating apps will put their, if you voted for Obama, don't message me. If you voted for Trump, don't even think of talking to me. And so this just exacerbates and hardens these positions, and it really results in people turning their backs towards each other.
Yeah, we even see families breaking up, with people refusing to talk to brothers and sisters or parents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. And, I think it's terrible. And I think while there are these systemic problems driving it, and those are the primary causes, in my opinion, we have to find ways to push back against that and do our best not to just be exploited by these forces that end up profiting from division, whether it's political consultants in whose interest it is, of course, to paint the other side as a threat to the existence of humanity. Please donate now.
Right.
Or whether it's a company that's making a ton of money on drawing your eyeballs to their webpage or their social media platform. And, one of those ways I think is, it might seem a little pie in the sky, but I think it's one of the few tools we have to rely on under these circumstances is just improving people's understanding of basic civics, and the basic tools of debate on which the country was founded. Because I look at a lot of these Facebook disputes, and you can see where it's going to go wrong right off the bat, because instead of actually following the well-understood principles of having a productive debate, people just start calling each other's names.
Right.
Calling each other names. And, I get into these debates on Facebook, and I actually think that it's a good thing to do if you can do it without calling your opponent names and by actually responding to their points and trying to actually engage with them. And, it can be a vigorous debate, but it doesn't have to be hateful. There's no reason for that.
Well, I think we could also look to, at some point, political leaders, that's part of what they're elected to do, is to lead and to lead by example. And oftentimes, we're seeing people lead by the worst examples on both sides of the aisle. Recently, word got out that the freshman congresswoman from New York had said that anybody in the party who's going to work with the people on the other side, you're going to get primaried. Well, yeah. What good does that do for political comedy? That's as bad as people on the Republican side saying the same thing. Because if the people on the left and the right can't work together to come up with common solutions, things are just going to get worse. And whatever solutions to the problems that beset us are out there are going to be cram downs, right? It's going to be the attitude of, we need to get enough of a majority on our side so that we want to get something done. We're going to ram it right down the throats of everybody who doesn't want it. And that seems to be the prevailing attitude for the most part among a majority of people, is let's just get a supermajority and ram what we want across.
Yeah, and that's really a Pyrrhic victory. It's really no kind of victory at all, because you're just going to be fighting rearguard actions for the entire time you're in power, and you'll be frustrated by the level of bitterness and opposition that you're facing.
Mike?
Well, and it all goes away. That's the funny thing about zero-sum politics is, in 2008, the Democrats had the White House, both branches of government. You see the rise of the Tea Party movement in response because, people feel that they don't have any voice in their government. 8 short years later, the exact opposite happens. Donald Trump is the president, the Republicans have the Senate and the House, and you see the rise of kind of the left with, the Occupy movement and others. What's happening is there's two really fascinating dynamics, and you see it again here in California very, very specifically. First, there's this rise in disaffiliation, where there are now more people that have no party preference or don't identify with a party than and the Republican Party, and both major parties' registration is collapsing at a rate faster than we've seen in 150 years. And yet we are also, at the same time, seeing the rise of hyperpartisanship, which are two very different data sets, and they seem to not be correlate. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you realize what's happening is the parties are now used to identify what we are against rather than what we are for. Mm-hmm. And that makes the environment for arguing almost there's no other solution, because the ideological core of both parties are now extremely malleable, and the fluidity with which the leaders in both parties are really more a function of creating the enemy on the other side, which Donald Trump has really brought to a new level of expertise. But you are seeing it, as you mentioned, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez employing those same tactics. Is if you even work with the other side, you are part of the problem. And because we're dealing with this, the end of time scenarios, and both sides engage in this type of behavior. It's not a partisan judgment, other than to say both parties a pox on both of their houses. And so as long as the parties are continuing to define themselves and keeping their coalitions together by who they are against and what they are against, we are really never going to break the shackles of this toxic environment, this toxicity of not being able to communicate. Because if the whole predicate, if the whole basis of your existence and your political identity is literally defined by the people you are trying to stop, well, then by definition, working with the other side is literally working with the enemy. And that's where we find ourselves. Mm-hmm. So I think the solutions to it are actually, they're there. They're possible. But it really requires an overt rejection of this broken two-party system. And I'm not suggesting we go to a multi-party system. I think this stuff will happen on its own. But this idea that somehow your party is more virtuous than the other party is not only ridiculous, but it's literally undermining the whole basis of the compromise required in a democracy.
Yeah, and it's been shown to be false as well over time.
Sure.
Yeah, and if you're going to run a country based on virtue, theoretically, and who's moral and who isn't, that's not a democracy. It's some form of theocracy. It's what they have in a place like Iran.
Right.
And the United States was founded explicitly not to be that. It grew out of the Enlightenment, the age of reason.
Yes.
And that's founded on the idea that we'll have different opinions, but we're going to base those opinions on underlying facts and logic. Mm-hmm. And we're going to recognize we live in an imperfect world where we are not going to achieve perfect solutions. Here's another historical parallel. The French Revolution was based on the assumption that they had discovered the perfect solution to running a society. They had science was then new, and they thought they could apply science to running society. And they thought, well, we have the scientific answer to running a perfectly just society. But the trouble is, if you believe you have the ownership of perfection, people who disagree with you have to be eliminated.
Right.
And so you end up with the guillotine.
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
In any democracy, you have to be willing to lose elections, and you have to be willing to not get 100% of what you want.
One last thing. What I thought was interesting was that President Obama said that on exiting the office, that one of his regrets was using executive orders so much because they could be easily undone by his the next president. Well, look at what the current president is doing. Lots of executive orders. It's as if he didn't hear what Obama said, and the reality is the next president, and if it's someone from another party, will undo these executive orders. And I've come to believe that the use of the executive orders oftentimes leads it contributes to political division, because if you rely on legislative solutions, more often than not, you are going to have some sort of compromise in that legislation that is going to make whatever the answer to the question is, or the answer to the problem, is going to be more palatable to more people, because they can see that it was an effort of bipartisanship that came to this particular answer.
What government does is an expression of what the people want. It'll be imperfect, but that's what it's supposed to be based in. And I would say, a lot of people would, continuing the sort of us versus them way of explaining everything, would say, well, Obama, it was his fault for doing all those executive orders, but I would say it's more of another symptom of a system that was breaking down because the sides were not cooperating with each other. He was facing a Congress that was just motivated by the desire to try to make him fail, essentially.
Yeah.
And that goes back decades now, as Mike has described. And so you see presidents resorting to executive, or at least President Obama resorting to executive orders, and now, as you say, President Trump is continuing that, and it's all just signs that, as I say, democracy's in trouble. Yeah. And we all have a responsibility to try to save it.
Gentlemen, I have to wrap it up here, but before we go, I want to give the last to final word, second to final word to Mike Madrid here as we wrap things up. Mike?
Yeah, I think, look, we are entering a period of extraordinary change. And I'm not convinced that democracy itself is being threatened, but what I am convinced of is that the nature of democracy is changing, like so many other things. And I think we are going to have to find different governmental solutions that meet a more democratic goal with civic and citizenship engagement and involvement. I'm not certain that the institutions that we built or have built 100, 200 years ago meet the needs of the modern age. And I don't know that that's a bad thing. It's a different thing. We need to keep a hold of our basic core principles and values, but build a system that works for the modern age as we proceed. Because if we do not, that inflexibility may also mean that it will be the undoing of a lot of what we have accomplished and built as a society here in the States over the past 250 plus years.
All right. That's Mike Madrid. He's a nationally recognized expert on Latino voting trends, the former press secretary for the California Republican leader, former political director for the California Republican Party, and the founder of Consultancy Grassroots Lab. And as we go here, Spencer Critchley, I want to give you kind of the last word so you can tell us about saving democracy, when and where it happens, and how people can get in.
Well, saving democracy is going to be an opportunity to hear from Mike, as well as 5 other panelists joining me as the moderator. And all of our panelists are people who have national and statewide experience in politics, government, and media. I encourage people to go to bootsroad.com/democracy. That's bootsroad.com/democracy. You can find all the details there, and you can register for free admission. It's happening at Cabrillo College's Bamper Recital Hall, which is a beautiful facility, by the way, on March 21st, starting at 7 p.m., and the doors open at 6:30 p.m.
All right. Gentlemen, thank you both for your time today on the iHeart Community Spotlight.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it.
You've been listening to the iHeart Community Spotlight, a weekly public affairs presentation of iHeart Media, Salinas, Monterey. And if you have any comments or questions or suggestions for a future program, write to us in care of Public Affairs Director, iHeart Radio, 1550 Moffett Street, Suite C, Salinas, California, 93905.